The Aegean Sea had surrendered secrets before, but rarely ones that bewildered archaeologists as much as this one. On a grey morning in early spring, 3 fishermen working the waters off the eastern coast of Crete hauled their nets heavy with more than octopus and grouper. Tangled among the rope and debris lay a statue, marble, weathered by centuries, depicting a bearded male figure of unmistakable divine proportion. Yet something was profoundly wrong. The iconography matched no known Greek deity. The style was classical, the craftsmanship masterful, but the facial features, the strange symbols carved into the base, and the peculiar gesture of the god's raised hand suggested something far older and far more mysterious than any temple record acknowledged. Within days, word reached the University of Crete. Within weeks, a team of investigators arrived at the small fishing village of Citeia, armed with cameras, measurement tools, and unanswered questions. But the fishermen, brothers named Nikos and Stavros, along with their crew member Dimitris, had already begun their own investigation. They knew these waters intimately. They knew the tides, the currents, the geography of the seafloor, and they knew that no statue simply ended up in a net by accident. Something or someone had placed it there deliberately, weighted or released centuries ago with the intention of hiding it beneath fathoms of water and time. What the brothers didn't know was that uncovering the statue's origins would lead them far beyond the museum and into a labyrinth of family secrets, academic rivalry, and a discovery that would rewrite understanding of ancient religious practice in the Mediterranean. Chapter 1. The Weight in the Net. The morning light broke reluctant and pale across the water. Nikos gripped the winch handle, feeling the familiar resistance of the net as it rose from below. 40 years he had done this, since he was a boy watching his father work the same stretch of sea. Stavros, 3 years younger but broader in the shoulders, stood ready with the gaff hook, his movements practiced and economical. "Heavy today," Stavros said, his breath visible in the cold air. "Too heavy." Nikos didn't like it. The weight was wrong, dense and unyielding, not the distributed pressure of a full catch. Dimitris, standing at the stern, had already noticed. His hand moved instinctively to the knife at his belt, ready to cut the line if something was fouling the net. The net broke the surface in a cascade of white water. Fish tumbled and glinted in the grey light. But beneath them, pale as bone, something else emerged. At first Nikos thought it was a large rock. He'd hauled those before, pulled up from the seabed where they had no business being. But as the net cleared the water and the thing swung closer, detail resolved into form. It was a head, a face, a statue. Stavros cursed in Greek, the kind of curse reserved for genuine shocks. The 3 men stood frozen as the marble figure rotated slowly in its net, dripping seawater and trailing strands of weed. It was perhaps 5 feet tall, carved from what looked like Parian marble. The expensive kind, the kind used for gods and kings. The face was bearded, noble, with eyes that seemed to stare directly at them, despite their blank, pupilless gaze. "Call the police," Nikos said finally. "This is archaeology, not crime," Stavros replied, already photographing with his phone. "We call the university." But neither of them moved. They stood in the boat, watching the statue swing slightly in the net, studying the strange symbol carved into its base, a mark that resembled neither Greek nor Roman script. Water streamed from the figure's raised right hand, which held something small, something the fisherman couldn't quite make out from this angle. The metal, bronze, had oxidized to a deep green patina. "How long has it been down there?" Dimitris wondered aloud. No one answered. The statue gave nothing away, only stared with its empty eyes toward a horizon it hadn't seen in centuries. Chapter 2. The university arrives. Professor Elena Casares arrived in a sedan that struggled on Citea's narrow streets, driven by a young archaeology student named Nolan, who chewed gum nervously and checked his phone every 30 seconds. Elena herself was methodical, precise, a woman in her late 50s with grey, streaking her dark hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority in academic circles. She examined the statue in a makeshift workspace at the local town hall, where Nikos had arranged for it to be carefully transported and placed on a long table. Elena photographed it from every angle, her hands moving with practiced reverence as she documented details, the quality of the marble, the pattern of erosion, the depth and precision of the carving. "Where exactly was this recovered?" she asked, not looking up. Nikos provided coordinates. Elena plotted them on a map, her frown deepening. "That's nearly 2 kilometers from the nearest known shipwreck site." She glanced at him. "You're certain?" "The GPS marked it. We have the coordinates in our logs." She turned her attention back to the base of the statue, to the symbol Nikos had noticed. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she photographed it. This was not a tremble of age, but of recognition, and something like concern. "Have you told anyone else about this? Any other archaeologists? Any officials?" "Only you," Stavros said. "We wanted the university to examine it first." Elena nodded slowly. She seemed to be weighing something internal. "This symbol," she said quietly, "doesn't appear in any catalogued Greek temple records. And the style of the statue, the proportions, the technique, they're classical, yes, but something is off. Something is deliberately hidden in plain sight." "Meaning," Nikos pressed, "meaning this statue represents a god that the ancient Greeks may have actively tried to forget." Nolan stopped chewing his gum. Even Elena seemed surprised by her own words, as if speaking them aloud had given them weight she hadn't intended. Outside, the Aegean wind rattled the shutters of the town hall, and neither the fishermen nor the archaeologists noticed Stavros slip his hand toward his phone, photographing Elena's face as she stared at the statue's unsettling gaze. If you're enjoying this adventure so far, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Chapter 3. The first clue. The symbol on the base haunted Elena for 2 full days. She'd photographed it, measured it, sketched it in her notebook, and compared it against every reference database available. Nothing matched. It wasn't linear A, wasn't linear B, wasn't any recognizable script from the Aegean Bronze Age or Classical period. "It's intentionally obscure," she told Nikos when she returned to his home for dinner on the second evening. Stavros was there too, along with Dimitris. Elena had brought Nolan, who photographed the meal with uncomfortable enthusiasm before settling into quiet observation. "Could it be a name?" Stavros asked. "A signature from the sculptor?" "Perhaps, but the placement is too formal. And look at this." Elena pulled out an enlarged photograph. The symbol repeated, 3 times along the base, carved with identical precision. This is deliberate repetition. In ancient inscriptions, that usually indicates importance. A prayer, a curse, or a name invoked repeatedly for protection or power. She sipped her wine. The house smelled of lemon and olive oil, of the sea and wood smoke. It was the house where Nikos had been born, where his father had kept charts and maps of every fishing ground for 50 kilometers. "My father kept journals," Nikos said suddenly. "Records of what he found in the nets over 40 years. Most of it was garbage, old anchors, pottery shards, ship debris. But there are entries, passages where he mentions finding stone, marked with symbols he didn't recognize. He thought they were cursed stones, he called them." Elena's attention sharpened. "Where are these journals?" "Upstairs. I never paid much attention to them. After he died, Stavros and I kept fishing the way he taught us. The journals seemed Finished business. He rose without waiting for permission and returned 15 minutes later with a leather-bound book, its pages yellowed and salt-stained. Elena opened it with reverence reserved for ancient texts, though this was merely 50 years old. Nolan moved closer with his phone. The first pages contained mundane entries, catch weights, weather conditions, equipment repairs. But Nikos had remembered correctly. Page after page, particularly from entries spanning the late 1970s through the early 1980s, contained sketches and descriptions of finds that didn't belong in standard archaeological records. "These markings," Elena whispered, pointing to a sketch on page 47. It was crude, drawn by someone without artistic training, but undeniable. It was the same symbol, the identical mark from the statue's base. "He found it," Stavros breathed. "Our father found the same symbol." "How many times?" Elena flipped carefully through the pages, marking entries. 7 times across 7 years. All recovered from different locations, all within 5 kilometers of where you found the statue. "Why didn't he report them?" Nolan asked, breaking his silence. Nikos was quiet. "My father was a fisherman, not an archaeologist, and—" He hesitated. "There's a passage. May I?" He took the journal and found a specific entry dated March 1982. He read aloud. "Found 3 stones today with the strange mark. Dimitris, my cousin, he said his grandfather told him never to speak of such things. The old families don't speak of such things. The church doesn't approve of the old gods. Certain knowledge was forgotten for a reason. I will keep the stones, but I will say nothing." The room had gone silent. The wind outside seemed to quiet as well. "The old families," Elena repeated. "Who are the old families in Citeia?" Chapter 4. The Inheritance. What followed was 3 days of careful questioning, record-checking, and a gradual mapping of local genealogies. Stavros and Nikos discovered they were far more connected to Citeia's history than they'd realized. Their father's side traced back to Byzantine times. But before that, in the gaps where records grew thin and uncertain, there were older roots. Roots that went back to classical antiquity, possibly further. Elena brought in an expert on Cretan family histories, a woman named Dr. Sophia Metaxas, who worked at the Archaeological Museum of Heraklion. Sophia was elderly, sharp-eyed, and spoke with the peculiar authority of someone who had spent 50 years assembling local records from dusty archives and village gossip. "The old families," she explained over coffee in the town's lone cafe, "didn't disappear. They changed their names, they converted to Christianity, they integrated. But in the villages, the memory remained. Oral histories passed down through bloodlines. My own grandmother would never allow certain discussions in the house. She said they were things the church forbade us to remember." "Were these things connected to pagan worship?" Elena pressed. Sophia was reluctant. "There were cults," she said finally. "Worship practices that survived the Christianization of Crete. Not openly, of course. That would have brought inquisitorial attention. But in secret spaces, in caves and isolated locations, certain groups maintained rituals. Most of these worships were extensions of known Olympian cults, Zeus, Poseidon, Artemis. But there were whispers of something else, something older. Something that the mainstream temples had deliberately suppressed, even in antiquity." Nikos leaned forward. "A god. A god whose name had been erased," Sophia said quietly. "A god deemed heretical or dangerous. The classical Greeks were pragmatic about theology. If a cult became problematic, they didn't always wage war against it. Sometimes they simply erased it from the record, made it illegal to speak its name, to honor it, to even acknowledge its existence. Over generations, the god passed from history into family legends, into whispered stories, told only to those of the bloodline." She looked directly at Nikos and Stavros. "The question is whether your family was the keeper of such stories." Chapter 5. The Dig. With permission from local authorities and the Greek Ministry of Culture, Elena proposed an excavation at the exact coordinates where the statue had been found. The site lay in shallow water, perhaps 8 meters down, accessible to divers, difficult but not impossible to conduct a controlled archaeological survey. They set up a small camp on a rocky beach nearby, bringing in diving equipment, documentation tools, and a team of 4 specialists. Nikos and Stavros participated, having negotiated a role as consultants given their knowledge of the waters. Dimitris helped manage the boat. The first dive revealed something extraordinary. Not scattered debris, but what appeared to be an intentional deposit. The statue had been placed in a submerged stone structure, a kind of chamber or sanctuary carved directly into the seafloor bedrock. The chamber was roughly 6 feet by 8 feet, sealed with fitted stone blocks that had somehow remained coherent despite millennia of tidal pressure and seismic activity. "This was deliberate," Elena said when she reviewed the diver's footage. "This wasn't a shipwreck or an accident. Someone placed this statue in a chamber and sealed it. They wanted it hidden but preserved." The second dive opened the chamber carefully, revealing interior chambers. Inside were vases, fragments of bone, and most significantly, a bronze box, sealed with corroded clasps. "This is an offering," Sophia breathed, studying the photographs. "An ancient religious offering. But look at the deposit, the methodology. This isn't classical Greek. The technique predates that by centuries. This is Minoan. This might date to the Bronze Age." Nikos felt the weight of history settle on him. His family had been fishing these waters for generations. His father had found stones bearing the same symbol. How many generations before that had known of this place? How many had kept the secret? On the evening after the chamber was opened, Stavros pulled Nikos aside. "Someone was watching the excavation today," Stavros said quietly. "A man on the cliff above the beach. When I looked up, he was photographing the site. When he saw me see him, he left." Nikos's stomach tightened. "Did you recognize him?" "No, but—" Stavros hesitated. He moved like someone accustomed to fieldwork, like he knew what he was looking at. He wasn't a tourist. Chapter 6. The Bronze Box. Opening. The bronze box took another full day. The corrosion was severe, the seals ancient and fragile. Elena worked with extreme care, documenting each stage of the process. Inside, wrapped in what had once been cloth, but was now merely decomposed fiber, lay something that made even the veteran archaeologists go quiet. A scroll, or rather scrolls, perhaps a dozen thin pieces of papyrus, damaged but partially readable, and with them, several small clay tablets, inscribed with the same mysterious symbol that marked the statue's base. "It's a prayer," Sophia said, her voice trembling slightly as she examined the tablets under magnification. "A prayer or a hymn. And this symbol." She pointed to the repeated marking. "It's a name, or a placeholder for a name. The practitioner, the person who wrote this, couldn't write the name directly. It was forbidden, so they used the symbol as a substitute." "What does the prayer say?" Nolan asked. Sophia leaned closer, using every skill she'd accumulated over 50 years of studying ancient texts. Her translation came slowly, carefully. "Forgive us for forgetting you. Forgive us for pretending you never were. We keep your name in symbol so that the forbidden may remain honored in secrecy. To you whose worship the temples denied, whose name the councils erased, we offer this sanctuary, this memory, this small defiance of the erasure." The afternoon light was fading. Elena stood at the tent's edge, looking out at the darkening sea. "This changes everything," she said. "Not just our understanding of Minoan classical religious syncretism, but potentially our whole framework for understanding how suppressed cults operated in the ancient Mediterranean." She paused, something like concern crossing her face. This is going to attract attention, significant attention, academic interest, certainly, but also other kinds. She was right. By evening, two things happened. First, news of the discovery leaked, probably through Nolan's social media updates, though he'd been instructed not to post. The story began circulating in academic forums. Unknown deity discovered off Crete, Bronze Age god erased from history, mystery god of forbidden worship. Second, the man appeared again. This time he wasn't on the cliffs. He came directly to the camp as darkness fell, introduced himself as Dr. Marcus Reeves from the British Museum, and asked to see the artifacts. Eleanor refused, politely but firmly. But something in his expression made the hair on Nikos's neck stand up. Reeves didn't seem surprised by the refusal. He seemed to have expected it. As he was leaving, he paused and said something that would echo through everything that followed. "I'd be very careful about the publicity on this find. Some families have reasons, old reasons, to prefer that certain gods remain forgotten. If this treasure hunt already has you hooked, hit the like button. It helps us bring more forgotten stories to light." Chapter 7. The rival investigation into Dr. Marcus Reeves revealed a complicated history. He'd been connected to the British Museum for 20 years, but had left under ambiguous circumstances 5 years ago. His specialty was pre-classical Mediterranean religious practices, particularly the suppression of minority cults during the Hellenization period. He'd published papers, academic, rigorous, well-regarded. But he'd also published papers with more controversial theses, that certain suppressed deities had been actively erased through coordinated effort, that ancient councils had destroyed records, that deliberate historical amnesia had occurred. "He's looking for the same thing we are," Sophia said quietly to Elena. "Not the artifacts, the story. The proof that a deity was systematically erased." "But why?" Elena asked. The answer came from a different direction. Nikos received a letter, actually a letter, written by hand and delivered by post, from a woman named Callista Theodosis. She lived in Chania, 2 hours west. She wrote that she was a descendant of the old Cretan families, that she'd learned through family records of the discovery, and that she needed to meet with Nikos urgently. Nikos showed the letter to Stavros, who looked troubled. "It's a trap," Stavros said immediately. "For what? She's offering information." "Exactly. And she wants to meet you alone, away from the camp and the archaeologists." But Nikos was curious. He was also troubled by the statue, by the sense that he and Stavros had inadvertently disrupted something that had been deliberately hidden. So he went, driving to Chania in his truck, leaving early on a morning when Elena was occupied with analyzing the papyrus fragments. Callista turned out to be a woman in her 70s, elegant and precise in manner, living in a house that seemed to contain centuries of accumulated books and documents. She offered him coffee and spoke with a clarity that suggested she'd organized her thoughts carefully before this meeting. "Your family," she said, "was one of the keeper families. The families entrusted with certain knowledge. Not many people know about the keepers, even now, but the records exist. The responsibility has passed down through bloodlines for over 2,000 years. You and your brother inherited that responsibility when your father died." "What responsibility?" Nikos asked. "To ensure that the statue of Ionis remained hidden," she said. "That is the forbidden name, Ionis, the god whose worship was suppressed by the classical Greek temples because his followers refused to recognize the supremacy of Zeus. because they maintained that Ionis had been worshipped long before the Olympians arrived, that he represented an older, deeper truth about the human relationship to divinity. The temples couldn't tolerate that. So they made him illegal. They destroyed his temples, eliminated his priests, burned his records. But a few families refused to forget. We kept his memory alive in secret spaces, in symbols, in hidden offerings placed where only the faithful would find them. She leaned forward. Your father was one of us, though he chose to distance himself from the responsibility. But your father also understood something crucial. If the knowledge remained hidden, if the God remained forgotten, then in some strange way the forgetting was a kind of protection. Revealing him now, letting him become famous, turns him into an object, a curiosity, and that attracts people like Dr. Reeves. What does Reeves want? Nikos asked. To prove his theories, to advance his career, but also, she paused, also to find something else that Ionis's followers hid, something that supposedly contains the real reason the classical temples were so desperate to erase him. The conversation continued for 2 more hours. By the time Nikos left, his understanding of his inheritance had fundamentally shifted. The statue wasn't just an archaeological curiosity, it was a key. And somewhere in the mythology surrounding it, in the records that Ionis's followers had preserved in secret, was a secret significant enough that multiple people across centuries had deemed it worth protecting. When he returned to the excavation camp, he found Elena in animated discussion with Sophia. On the laptop screen was an email from the British Museum, officially requesting access to the artifacts for comparative analysis. It's Reeves, Elena said quietly. He's using institutional pressure. They'll get the artifacts, whether I want to share them or not. It's just a question of how quickly. Stavros, standing near the tent entrance, said, Then we need to find the rest of it first. Whatever Callista mentioned, whatever else was hidden, we find it before Reeves does. Chapter 8. The Hidden Sanctuary. The papyrus fragments, when fully translated, contained references to locations, not explicit directions, but descriptions that Sophia recognized. Caves in the White Mountains, where ancient rituals had allegedly taken place, according to local legends. A specific cave system near the village of Samaria held particular significance in the fragmentary text, a phrase repeated 3 times. Where the waters run silent and the old stone speaks. Reaching it required planning. The cave system was protected as a natural monument, requiring permits, but Elena, with her institutional authority, arranged access for a geological survey. They assembled a team: Elena, Sophia, Nikos, Stavros, Nolan, and 2 graduate students. They left at dawn, driving toward the White Mountains as clouds gathered overhead. The cave entrance was narrow, concealed behind vegetation. But once inside, it opened into enormous chambers, vast underground halls where water echoed and stalactites hung like stone icicles. The air was cold and still. They moved carefully, documenting everything. In the deepest chamber they found it, an altar, made of stone fitted so precisely that no mortar had been needed. And on that altar, carved into the stone itself, were dozens of the forbidden symbols. Around the chamber's walls, painted in pigments that had somehow survived millennia, were images, figures in ritual procession. A bearded male deity receiving offerings, scenes of worship and devotion. But most significantly, recessed into the stone behind the altar, was a small chamber. Inside lay another bronze box, this one smaller, newer than the first, though newer here meant only a few centuries old rather than millennia. When opened, carefully, with great reverence, it contained a single scroll, written in medieval Greek, and a key. The scroll was a letter dated to approximately 1600 CE, written by someone named Michalis Theodosis. The letter explained that he was the final keeper authorized to maintain the knowledge of Ionis in active practice. After his time, the letter stated the cult was becoming too risky to maintain openly, even in secret. So he was sealing this knowledge, this final testimony, with a key to unlock further records. The key was literal. It opened a chamber beneath the Metropolitan Church in Chania, where the most dangerous records were kept. The church, Nolan whispered. One of the old churches, Sophia corrected, built on the foundations of something else. Many Mediterranean churches were constructed directly atop pagan temples. The symbolic inversion was intentional. Christianity literally built on top of what came before. But what if, in at least one instance, the builders deliberately preserved something beneath? Elena was photographing everything, but she looked troubled. This is no longer just archaeology. This is revealing something that communities, even now, even in the modern world, chose to keep hidden. If we make this public, we bring it to light, Stavros said firmly. The statue was brought to light. This is the story it was asking to tell. They were so focused on documenting the chamber that they almost didn't notice the man watching from the cave entrance. It was Marcus Reeves. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood two other men, neither dressed like archaeologists. One was holding a small camera, recording, not photographing. The other had his hand inside his jacket. "I was hoping it would come to this," Reeves said calmly. "I was hoping you'd find the sanctuary, save me weeks of searching." Eleanor stepped forward. "This is a protected site. Unauthorized personnel are not—" "I'm quite aware of what this site is," Reeves interrupted, "and I'm quite aware of what's beneath the church in Chania. I've been searching for Ionis's original texts for 15 years, the institutional records, not just the devotional ones. The texts that explain why he was so dangerous, why the suppression had to be so complete. Nikos felt the wrongness of it then. The chamber, which moments before had felt like a sacred space, now felt trapped, exposed, violated. "You can't take anything," Sophia said quietly. The legal protections, Reeves smiled, "will be far less relevant once I publish what I know. Ionis wasn't just a suppressed deity. According to certain texts I've already acquired, he represented something that the classical elites actively feared, a theology of equality, of human dignity, outside the framework of hierarchical gods and hierarchical society, a deity who taught that all humans possessed divine essence. Do you understand why that would be dangerous to recorded history, why that would need to be erased?" He stepped further into the chamber. His men moved with him, spreading out slightly. "I'm taking the scroll, and you're all going to help me reach the church in Chania. Tonight." Chapter 9. The Revelation. What happened next occurred so quickly that no one could quite agree on the sequence of events afterward. Dimitris, who had remained outside the cave as lookout, appeared suddenly with a rope. Nolan, either through courage or panic, threw his laptop at one of Reeves's men. Stavros tackled Reeves, while Nikos grabbed the second man's arm, preventing him from drawing whatever might be in that jacket. The violence lasted perhaps 90 seconds. No one was seriously hurt, though bruises would appear later. What mattered was that Elena and Sophia managed to secure the scroll, and that one of Reeves's men, faced with the prospect of a genuine altercation against 6 people in an isolated cave, decided that the enterprise wasn't worth his continued employment. By the time the police arrived, called by Dimitris with a cell signal from the cave entrance, Reeves and his team were already attempting to leave. They were detained for questioning, charged with trespassing and attempted theft of protected artifacts. But Reeves wasn't wrong about one thing: the revelation couldn't be contained. Within 48 hours, news of the sanctuary's discovery spread globally. Archaeological journals published preliminary reports. News media, sensing the religious and historical significance, amplified the story. The statue of the forgotten god, the hidden sanctuary, the evidence of systematic suppression. It became an international story, one that raised questions about how history had been deliberately curated and what other suppressed knowledge might exist in the archaeological record. The scroll, when fully translated and published, did indeed contain remarkable passages. Aeonis was described as a deity who taught that divinity was not the exclusive province of gods or kings, but something inherent to all people. His followers rejected hierarchy, rejected violent sacrifice, rejected the subordination of women in religious practice. In other words, they were radically egalitarian, incompatible with the society that classical Greece was constructing. The texts didn't prove that Aeonis had actually existed or that he'd been actively worshipped. They proved only that someone had believed in him deeply enough to preserve his memory through centuries of enforced silence. But that was revolutionary enough. It suggested that history wasn't simply what had been, but what had been chosen to be remembered, and that which had been deliberately forgotten might contain truths that challenged current understanding. 3 months after the excavation ended, the scroll and the statue were placed on public display at the Archaeological Museum of Heraklion, alongside extensive contextual information about suppressed cults and the keeper families who had maintained Aeonis's memory. Scholars from around the world requested access to the materials. Theologians published papers about the implications. The University of Crete established a new research center dedicated to studying deliberately erased histories. Nikos and Stavros found themselves unexpected figures in the academic world. They were consulted on local history, on the significance of their family's role as keepers. More profoundly, they were forced to confront an inheritance they hadn't realized they possessed, a responsibility to remember what others had tried to forget. On the last evening before he returned to his normal fishing life, Nikos stood on the beach where the excavation had taken place. The water was calm, reflecting the stars. Stavros joined him, and for a long time they said nothing. "Do you think Father would have approved," Stavros finally asked, "of bringing it all into the light?" Nikos thought of the journals, of his father's careful sketches of the symbol, of the cryptic notation about forbidden things being forgotten for a reason. He thought of Callista's explanation, that sometimes the forgetting itself was a kind of protection. But he also thought of Sophia poring over texts, and Elena, dedicated to understanding, and all those throughout history who had paid the cost of truth being suppressed. "I think," Nikos said slowly, "that Father would have been terrified, but I also think he would have understood that some things are too important to remain hidden, that a God worshipped in secret by people seeking equality and dignity, that story deserves to be remembered, not as mystery, but as part of our actual history." The statue was safe now, protected in a museum, documented and studied. Aeonis would not return to active worship. That era had genuinely passed, but he would not remain forgotten either. The symbol would no longer be erased from records. The name, though still a name others didn't know, had been given context, history, a story of why it mattered. As Nikos walked back toward the village, the same place his father and grandfather and countless generations before had lived, he understood something that the statue itself seemed to know. That value isn't in the object, but in the truth it carries. The real treasure wasn't marble or bronze or ancient gold. It was the restoration of memory, the refusal to let certain kinds of knowledge simply vanish. Some secrets, he realized, had been kept not because they were dangerous, but because they were dangerous only to those in power. And sometimes the most revolutionary act wasn't discovering something new. It was remembering what had been deliberately erased. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of discovery and hidden history. See you in the next adventure.